Good evening and welcome. I'm Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas, and I am here with our Director of Education and Civic Engagement, Robin Palmer, and we are really excited to have you here tonight. This is the second in a series of engagement sessions focused on the work of the Vermont Civic Health Index. And before we get started, I just want to run through a few expectations of how the evening's going to go. I know everybody feels a little more comfortable when they know what to expect. We're going to do a quick overview of the report that you have seen, the Civic Health Index. To our thinking, the report is really just a starting point of the beginning of a conversation. This is what the data says about Vermont, but these engagement sessions that we're having in libraries across the state are really the opportunity for us to broaden and deepen our understanding of Vermonters' civic health. And that's why I'm so thankful that you're here and why we're doing all of these trips all over the state of Vermont, because it's really important to us to understand how do you see what's contained in that report and what are we missing? This is really an opportunity for us to think of this as building our marching orders for the coming years. So we're going to do a quick overview and presentation. Then we have a panel discussion, and we'll have a couple of folks coming up to talk about their reactions and responses to the Civic Health Index report. And then we're going to try to shift our location out into the hallway and the entry area, because we've got some snacks out there. We've got some small group breakout groups that we'd like to do, and we want to invite you to do them out there where you can have snacks, because we can't bring food in here. And then we also have some wrap up that we will want to do that we'll get to as we move through the evening. So don't be surprised when we invite you to get up and move around, and please eat the snacks, because I'm sure that South Burlington doesn't want to have to take them all home with them. So want to jump in?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm not used to being able to be so far away from the microphone. That's luxurious. So I started this role a little over a year and a half ago, and when I came in, we had a lot of questions, and one of those things was, how are we doing as a state, and what does our civic engagement look like right now? And so I found this organization called the National Conference on Citizenship that does Civic Health Index reports, and 35 states have already done one. And so I thought, well, this would be a great project for us to do in Vermont and learn a little bit more about where we're at to get started. And I think, the first thing that came to mind for me was that we have a lot of partners that we're going to need to bring to the table. There's so many people already involved in this world. Just because my role is new doesn't mean that this hasn't been a focus for a lot of people in the state. And so I quickly connected with many of the folks that you're going to hear from in a little bit on the panel. Vermont Humanities, the Center for Rural Studies at UVM, SUR Vermont, the folks that run the AmeriCorps programs in Vermont, and a little bit after that, Up for Learning. And so all of these partners have been so instrumental in helping us get this off the ground. So I just want to say thank you to them quickly. And I think that I guess I'll say a little bit about the process to get started. So by signing up to work with the National Conference on Citizenship, they gave us a list of a lot of different indicators and where we rank nationally. So we could say, oh, we're 4th in the nation in this and 12th in the nation in this, and it gives us our percentage points. And so that was a really great place to get started, but we wanted to talk to a lot of people and say, how do these numbers land with you? Does this feel like it represents your experience? And so we brought together a lot of community partners for some early initial conversations. And in that time, we asked a question, what does civic health mean to you? All of you probably came in tonight with an idea of what it might mean to you. Here are some of the things that our partners said when we first started asking those questions.
So, you can see high level of trust in neighbors, institutions, and ourselves, trust, belonging, ownership, and also the skills required to engage in constructive dialogue. Understanding how systems of power work in a community and what the levers for change are. This is one that's really near and dear to me. When people in the community feel their systems work for them and that they are reflected in those systems, that's civic engagement. And the National Conference on Citizenship defines it as the way communities are organized to define and address public problems. And so, the real poignant examples in recent years of times when communities have had to come together around floods, for instance, really feels like this is a really good opportunity in Vermont for us to look at what is working in our communities and what can we be doing better.
And when we first got these indicators from the NCOC, as they're called, we, saw a lot of things that you might think of when you first think about civic engagement. So voting, volunteering, donating, things like that. But when we talked to people, there was a lot more focus on things like trust and belonging. And that, isn't as easy to quantify. So we understand why we're not necessarily getting ranked in those things. But it is something that matters a lot. And we wanted to make sure that we included it. So working with our advisory group that came together to help us, we put together these 6 domains of civic health. So you can see them there. And I think having a broader sense of civic engagement is really important for these conversations. And there's also a lot of Venn diagrams that you can create between these things. You don't necessarily need to keep them all separate, but we're trying to take a very broad, encompassing approach to different elements of civic engagement.
Great. Go ahead to the next one. So it was really important to me as we look at the civic health of Vermont to make sure that we're understanding the experience of youth living in Vermont as well. The basic data that NCOC brought to us wasn't necessarily indicative of what young people feel in terms of their connection to community. And I think you all probably know, as many of us have recognized, that COVID and the changes in the way we interact with each other have been really hard on young people. We're seeing a rise in young people experiencing mental health crises and a feeling of disconnect and not belonging. So it was really important to me that we make sure that we have a way of quantifying how our young people are doing. And so we had over 2,500 students in grades 7 through 12 complete this supplemental youth civic health survey. And then, as we are doing now, we also asked youth to come together and kick the tires on what those survey results were. And Up for Learning was critical in helping us to bring that information together with a group of students in a facilitated way so that we could get some deeper feedback.
All right, so we're going to jump in and I'm going to do a quick overview of some of the data. I think we want to save as much time tonight for conversation as we can. So I'll just also point out there are hard copies of this index on the table when you walked in. There's also a 1-page front and back executive summary. And most of what I'm saying is coming from that. So you should be able to refer to that if you'd like. But we're just going to touch on a few high-level things and just acknowledging that there could be a 40-page report or a 400-page report on each of these topics in Vermont. And so we just want to acknowledge that we know that this isn't the end-all be-all of all of that, but it's where we're starting. So for volunteerism and donating, we learned that Vermont ranks 5th in the country in informal helping and 13th for formal volunteerism. We also rank second in the country for donations to political organizations. I think, the thing that we thought was most interesting here and that we'd like to continue looking at is, I don't think it's really a surprise that we ranked higher in informal helping. If you think about all of the mutual aid networks and the neighbors helping neighbors and that being part of, the Vermont culture. But in terms of formal volunteering, that's also a really broad category. And so there's a lot of people were saying, we'd love to know, people serving on boards and commissions or in municipal roles that are that's technically volunteering, but that's very different than volunteering at an elementary school or serving in an AmeriCorps program. And all of those things have different flavors. So we're hoping we can learn more about that moving forward. Just one other thing. Here's some other findings around volunteerism, around demographics. So in the blue from the you can see that the youth are volunteering a lot, probably because there's a lot of formal opportunities for them to do that through school. And then it goes down and increases again over age. And then you also see it increasing over educational attainment and over income.
You knew that the next slide was mine. She's got this presentation memorized, I'm sure. So you're going to see a theme as we run through some of the highlights of the report. Vermont is going to come across as ranking pretty high compared to the other states who have done a Civic Health Index. We rank second in the country for attending public meetings, which shouldn't be a surprise given that our municipal government in many places in Vermont is primarily focused on the annual in-person town meeting, not so much maybe in some of the larger communities anymore. We rank second in the country for having contacted a public official, which I also think is a really beautiful thing, and something that's not a surprise because many House representatives in Vermont represent about 4,500 to maybe 8,000 people, and so it's not hard to come into contact with one of your Montpelier legislators because their slice of your community is relatively small compared to many other states where state representatives have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Do you have a question?
Forgive me, I'm not sure. Second in the country for contacted an official.
Oh.
What does that mean? That the official contacted us?
No.
We got in contact.
Yeah. Yes, for having contacted a public official.
Okay,
Yes.
contacting.
Thank you for pointing out that typo. Prize, because we did this presentation last week and nobody caught it. So good reading. So, the theme of having a very high rank, but a relatively low percentage in a lot of these indicators is really, I think, gives us a lot of room for growth, right? We shouldn't pat ourselves on the back if really only 18% of people have contacted a public official in Vermont. The next slide shows Vermont voter turnout, clearly another indicator of civic engagement. The top blue line being the presidential election years and the midterm elections being in green with typically lower turnout. And if you put the 2024 dot on there, it would be just as high as the 2020 dot was, with really good voter turnout in Vermont. Youth political engagement, we've got a point of concern here in my estimation. If you look at the blue slice of that pie, that is how many students answered no when asked if they planned to register to vote when they're old enough to do so. And I am thankful in Vermont that we have advocated for and passed automatic voter registration so that when you get your driver's license, you will be given the opportunity to automatically register to vote. So hopefully we'll catch some of those kids anyway, because we really would like them to be registered to vote. And because Vermont is now a universal vote by mail state for the November election, being registered to vote is what prompts you to vote, because otherwise you're not receiving a ballot on your kitchen table the way everyone else who's registered to vote is. So we certainly want to keep in mind how we reach young people and encourage them to engage in the political process. I want to talk just a little bit about social and community context. Again, a high rank might seem like a good thing, but let's not pat ourselves on the back. Working with neighbors to do something positive for your neighborhood or community. We have 31%, almost 32% of Vermonters saying they've done that, which is better than the national average, but that means 70% of Vermonters have not reported working on a common problem together. We ranked second for discussing political, societal, or local issues with neighbors, but again, that's only 14% of respondents reported that they do that. So lots of room for improvement there. Another area of the social and community context part of the report, we see an increase between 2013 and 2020 in the number of Vermonters who say they have not felt out of place because of their ethnicity, culture, race, skin color, language, accent, gender, sexual orientation, or religion, which is good. We're moving in the right direction, except that means 22% of Vermonters still responded that they feel out of place at times because of those demographic markers. So again, a lot that we could work on here. And back to the youth survey, in the past 12 months, how often did you talk to or spend time with people from a different racial, ethnic, or cultural background than yourself? Young people reported at least once a month, and I think that is probably much higher than most adults in Vermont would answer this question. So that's a positive point and one that should give us hope for the future, and perhaps cause us to ask how we could replicate that frequent interaction with people who are different than us in our adult worlds.
So the next domain is cultural access and engagement, and oh no.
There you go.
Is cultural access and engagement. And I just want to use this moment to give a brief shout out to a project that we inherited of our office working with Vermont Humanities, which is the Freedom and Unity comic book. I hope a lot of you have seen it before. There's some available on the back table if you've never gotten one. But those are, it's been a real joy to have such a great tool to talk to people about democracy in Vermont. And the artist, Dan Knott, has infused so much creativity into our work, and we're so excited to work with him. He also drew all of the art that's available in the index and that you're seeing on the slides right now. And so including cultural access and the arts as a domain of civic engagement felt really important to our office based on our partnerships, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Christopher from Vermont Humanities on the panel. But here's a few things that we learned about cultural access and engagement in Vermont. Nearly twice as many Vermonters report belonging to some group as the national average. 33% is still not super high. But youth, similar to volunteering, youth are saying 70% are part of some sort of group or organization. And so I think it's just kind of showing that when there's opportunities, people do want to get involved, and youth might have more opportunities through the school system. Another thing that we learned is that through the Vermonter poll, 93% of Vermonters either agreed or strongly agreed that the arts and culture were a very important part of a healthy community. We also saw that there was some decrease in satisfaction with available opportunities in Vermont. We think that's most likely due to COVID, but I think it's just worth noting that it's hard to get people to agree on much, and 93% of people agreeing is impressive. So I think it's just a reminder that we need to continue to invest in the creative sector. and doing media trust as well. So media trust was another domain that came up, and here there wasn't quite as much data coming from NCOC. The one indicator we do have is, again, we're ranking second, and number of people who report they frequently read, watch, or listen to the news. Interestingly, in the local Vermont poll, it was about 50-50 of people that decide if they get their news from local sources or from national news. So not like a giant sway one way or the other there. Another thing with media trust that was interesting was with youth. The 72% of youth say that they don't post about political or social issues on social media. And that seems higher than what you would think, given a lot of the narratives that we hear about young people. But when we sat down and talked to young people, a lot of them were pretty aware of disinformation and thinking about not wanting to contribute to that problem by posting something that was wrong when it came to those issues. So that was just an interesting point. We want to make sure people know that maybe that's an old narrative about youth. I'm going to close this out.
All right, government trust and access. Some highlights here in this realm. We see here that Vermonters trust local government more than they do state, and state government more than they do federal government. I think the takeaway on that is that the closer you are to your elected officials, maybe the easier it is to feel like they're listening. I think it's a great testament to the way we do municipal government and state government in Vermont. But you see the percentages are relatively low, and so I think there's always work that can be done. It's really easy for folks to hear stories about some elected official somewhere who did something that seemed wrong, and we know how some media outlets like to tilt towards the outrage before just looking at the facts. I think we need to be very wary of that as a state, that tipping towards outrage can be a factor that undermines people's interest in and ability to engage with their government. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about what's next.
I might have to ask you to take over for me. I have a tickle in my throat.
One of those Celsius for her.
So, as you might imagine, there's a lot of ideas out there about what we could do next. And one of the things, should I wait for myself?
Yes. Actually, why don't I just jump in for a moment? So we know that there are some glaring gaps in the data that we have in this report. And so a lot of what we want to focus on going forward is gathering more data. One of the glaring omissions or area of poor data is around the experiences of BIPOC Vermonters. You can imagine why, in a survey that's based mainly on the United States Census survey, that a population with a very low percentage of BIPOC Vermonters, might not have good data in that realm. So we know we need more data. These community conversations are an important part of where we're going next. How you feeling? Okay, jump right in.
One of the things that became most apparent early on in this process is that it is a big group effort. So if you look at a lot of other states, you see that they have statewide civic engagement coalitions. And I think, we want to keep the energy going from this work. And also, a lot of the ideas that have come up are great, but they're not necessarily all things that our office can do on our own. So having the coalition is an important part in trying to move all of this forward. There's some cool national efforts right now to build civic resource maps. And so we've been thinking about ways that we could do something like that here in Vermont, so people have a quick place to find lots of resources all together. Of course, we want to continue to support volunteerism efforts in Vermont, invest in arts and culture, improve access to civic spaces, and expand on civics education. And I'll just under that say, one of the things that my role has been most focused on is working with teachers to try and create curriculum that's Vermont specific, that's easy and fun, that they can use in their classrooms. We have one of those teachers here tonight. Thanks for being here, Joe. And also the resource that we created over on the table, if anyone wants to take a look. And another thing we've been talking about with civics education is creating a seal that could go on diplomas to incentivize schools. If a school or students meet certain requirements, then they could get a seal from the Secretary of State on their diploma to show that they have been civically engaged. So those are some of our ideas for next steps. We're going to be asking you your ideas for next steps later tonight, and we're also going to be asking for your help to prioritize some of these next steps. So just keep that in mind. All right, I think it's time to turn over to panel.
So why don't we have the panelists come up, and we will locate to the front panel area here. Oh, the lights. Excellent. Thank you. You can have a seat wherever you like. So panelists, you have a microphone in front of you, and if you push the little bar at the bottom of the stand, it will turn your microphone on. And what I'd like to do is, maybe starting with Christopher, invite you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about the Civic Health Index and this engagement and how it's relevant to your work. So Christopher, thank you.
All right, here it goes. I feel very official. You don't have to hold it. My name is Christopher. I'm the executive director of Vermont Humanities, and really pleased and proud to have worked with Robin and Sarah and the whole team on putting this together. We were inspired to get involved when I was at the National Humanities Conference in Los Angeles 3 years ago, and I learned that Rhode Island Humanities had been deeply involved in the Civic Health Index for Rhode Island, and it made me think, well, gosh, we should really be able to include arts and culture in civic health nationwide, but let's just start here. So when Robin came and said she wanted to do one for Vermont, I was like, we're in right away. I'll pass it down to LG.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm Lauren Glendavidian. I work at CCTV Center for Media and Democracy. We cover public meetings, and we're part of a network of 24 community media centers across the state and, of course, across the country. We have one of our camera people here covering, and we're deeply involved in both access to local government, community events, and building trust and confidence in the media. So thank you for including us.
Hello. So my name is Pat LeClaire. I'm a program director with the nonprofit organization Up for Learning, which is based here in Vermont, but increasingly is working with schools throughout New England and throughout the U.S. To bring youth and adults together to have conversations about how to make education better for all students. And it was wonderful to work with the Secretary of State's office around bringing young people into the conversation to look at their own data, along with Joe, who's there at the State House with 60 some odd students looking at the findings from the youth survey and having, in-depth conversations about what the young people saw in their own survey data.
Great. I'm Christina Barsky. I'm faculty at the University of Vermont. In addition to being the director of the Master of Public Administration program, so public service career professionals, my scholarship looks at election administration and administrators and concepts of trust and confidence in the process. And so while I am relatively new to Vermont, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I was very excited to see this work being undertaken, especially from the level that it is. It's not always the case around the country that this type of work is tackled by the Secretary of State's office. And so I see this really connecting deeply with the work that we do at UVM to prepare students who are either currently in the profession or looking for professional roles in the public service to be able to do that work here in Vermont or further afield effectively.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I think we'll jump right into the next question, but we'll start here with you, Christina. What is something from the index that surprised you?
Good question. I was making notes while you were talking too, because different things came to me. I think that one thing I highlighted actually when I told my class about this meeting today was the focus on young people, which is really inspiring. And I think that when I look and see sort of the distribution of volunteerism and age, income, and educational attainment, it makes me think about the precarity of sort of living in the 21st century, the struggles that people face day to day to, get your kids to school and get to work and get to the grocery store and do the laundry, and thinking a little bit about how to close those gaps sort of on an individual basis. So that was one of the things that surprised me about the report.
Yeah, I was surprised by how often Vermont came second in things. Who's coming in first?
Who is that state?
Yeah.
Who do we have to knock off?
In terms of having these conversations with young people about what they saw in their survey data, I think so. One place where those conversations went was, well, when you see something that is a challenge or a concern in terms of youth civic engagement, what are potential solutions that these young people could see? And I'm just always surprised by, I think, the practicality of the solutions that young people provide. I think when we as adults think about challenges to something like civic engagement, we can get very philosophical about how to address them. And young people are like, no, it just needs to be a more convenient meeting time. So that was a good surprise for me.
What stood out for me was the data on youth and media, and I think it's incomplete because I think there's a lot more to this story, that they are not depending on mainstream local and national news, but they are actually depending on what we don't consider to be mainstream, and they're consuming news and information not because it's I think it's viewed as a chore as opposed to something that's useful and relevant for them. And so the packaging of the information, we can talk more about. I also think I'm not surprised by levels of public participation because in our experience, until you start to pay taxes, you're not really paying attention to public policy decisions. So, I mean, that's a very general statement. But I think that it's true until public policy, South Burlington City Council meetings have to do with you. I think there's a hearing tonight in Burlington on cat licensing. So that's going to turn out a lot of people because that is relevant to them. But that's not always the subject of discussion at these meetings. So I think the gap in adult youth participation is not surprising, but I do think we need to renew our commitment to media literacy and thinking about how to make news and civic information relevant. Yeah.
I'll just build on that a little bit and say that one of the things that surprised me right from the beginning of the process was that issue of gaps in data. And we didn't do much original data collection for the Civic Health Index except the youth survey. And when you sort of dig deeper into the other data sources that were used, there's a lot of reasons to sort of question what that data shows. And I think what that means for us is that we have a lot of work to do in the future to understand what different kinds of people in Vermont actually think about what different kinds of communities, whether that's a split between the more urban communities in Chittenden County and the more rural communities in the Northeast Kingdom, whether that's just the differences in communities of color versus more white dominant communities, or youth versus adult feelings. And there's a lot more work to be done for Volume 2 to fill in a lot of those data gaps. I do want to offer a lot of gratitude to, I don't know whether it was Michael or Robin who drafted the What is a Vermonter box that appears towards the beginning. I think that's really key, and I want to draw your attention to that. We so often in Vermont divide ourselves into who is a Vermonter and who is not. And it's really nice to see it really broadly laid out that you're a Vermonter when you move here and you call yourself a Vermonter, and that's it. That's the end of the story.
Thank you for bringing that up. And, to your point, Christopher, I'm from rural eastern Orange County. Many of the people who live in my community, have to get in their car at 5 or 6 in the morning and drive 45 minutes or an hour to get to work. And that doesn't leave a lot of time for engagement with your own community when the geography of Vermont requires you to get up and leave your community. And when you think back to the slide we were presenting where we talked about how many Vermonters reported feeling uncomfortable because of their race or culture or language, I think if you expanded that to say how many feel out of place or uncomfortable because of your perceived economic status or level of education, I think many more Vermonters would say yes, they have felt out of place, and I think that's important for us to be mindful of in a state that has income disparities and educational attainment disparities that go back generations. And it does at times make it challenging. I guess I'll be honest, even the language that we're using right here, if I was talking about this with somebody in line at the grocery store in Bradford, I wouldn't be using those same words, right? And so I think it's a point of reminder to be mindful of how we interact with all of our neighbors, whether they're different from us because of their culture or language, or whether they're different from us because of their level of educational attainment. So we're going to go back to you, Christopher, at the end of the table. What do you see as the biggest challenge for Vermont right now in terms of civic health? And you can look at it from any of those domain angles. What are our biggest challenges? You can list more than one if you'd like.
Oh, gosh. Well, if taking it up to 40,000 feet, I would go back to the very beginning of your presentation and say that trust is one of the most challenging things to achieve in Vermont. I think there's a lot of sort of intergroup trust in small groups and communities. If you're in Bradford, there's probably a lot of trust of other people in Bradford. But I know, for example, I do a lot of work in the Northeast Kingdom, and talking to people who are in Craftsbury versus Greensboro, right? There's a lot going on there. And I live in Montpelier. Talking to people who live in Montpelier versus people in Barrie, there's a lot of distrust there. And so I think that is one of our bigger challenges around civic health, is continuing to kind of cross those barriers, cross those lines to people who are different from us.
Do you think that was addressed somewhat during a natural disaster?
A little bit, but not nearly enough. And I will just note that I lived on a street that was flooded. I have a high amount of social capital in my life. I had a lot of people coming to help me, but my retired neighbors in an identical house next door with identical problems had a real struggle getting people to come and help them.
And my observation, having traveled around the state to a lot of different communities after they were affected by flooding, was that communities at large organize themselves very differently. If you looked at the experience of homeowners and businesses in downtown Montpelier in 2023 versus downtown Barrie, they were very different experiences. And in 2024, when we went to Linden and saw that the terrible devastation that had happened across the Northeast Kingdom, the organization that was helping to facilitate volunteers there was really a regional organization, as opposed to, Linden coming together to rally folks in their own community. And so it's a really good moment in time for us to be thinking about how do we organize our communities and how do we come together when we have a disaster, because that working together, that collaboration is going to be essential going forward.
The disaster showed a lot of really good things about Vermonters. It also shone a glaring spotlight on the places where we fall down.
Yes. Other challenges?
I certainly don't know if this is like it is a pervasive challenge. Just that the feeling that everything from local issues to conversations about the news has like this political partisan valence to it, that I think does map on to kind of that class difference that we experience in our communities in Vermont, and that being noted by the young people that we spoke with as a barrier to their engagement, not wanting to become politically engaged at a local level, or feeling like it was kind of dangerous to become politically engaged because of the like intensity of the discourse. And I think that's a barrier for a lot of adults too. It can be a little bit of a downer to go to a public meeting that devolves because people aren't able to focus on, I suppose, the problem-solving aspects of local issues, but instead just kind of view everything through that hyper-partisan lens.
I think that the lack of curiosity that people have about each other is the biggest challenge. I don't think it's being cultivated in this political climate. I think it's actually it's the opposite. Let's not be curious. It could be dangerous. But I think that I don't have an answer about how to spark that curiosity. But in the end, wanting to know about the life of the people that live next door to you, or being interested in the life of a child and what they're doing, or talking to someone that you wouldn't normally agree with because you're interested to know about their experience. And there's a veneer that we put, in this period of time, the veneer is political. But if you get underneath the veneer, then of course there's so much we have in common. So I think if, especially, we work with young people to cultivate that curiosity and help them believe that it's not dangerous. I mean, sometimes it is, but ideas are not ideas are dangerous, but they're ideas. And we found in public access TV, we spent a lot of time setting up rules in the beginning. What are the rules? What's okay to put on? Well, of course, you can put anything on. So how do you deal with the Ku Klux Klan coming in? Or how do you deal with pornography? So pornography was like the big thing that we were all worried about. Well, it wasn't pornography that became the most controversial things on these local channels. It's ideas that people don't agree with, and they disagree so vehemently that they will, put stickers like anti-trans stickers around the city of Burlington, or like these crazy things that people will do. And that's where the controversy comes. So I think trying to learn more about why people think what they think and protecting yourself in that process would be good for us to promote.
Yes, challenges that you see to Vermont civic health.
I'll do two, but quickly. The first, I think this conversation tonight is really helping sort of address the challenge, which is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? Like, we don't have those problems here. We're not that type of community. I think that there's a lot to be said for, celebrating the successes that we see, but I appreciate the conversation around where there's opportunities for growth and improvement. So I think that not getting stuck in, we don't have those issues here in Vermont. Those are other people's problems. More specifically, I would say connecting back to this concept that we talked about a little bit related to sort of geographic differences and also COVID is isolation and connectivity, right? This idea of getting to know your neighbor, this idea of when the flood happens, who can you go and count on? As a relatively newcomer, right? Going around and just saying hi to the people in my neighborhood to, introduce myself. I think that the challenge that we face is overcoming these, right? We've gotten really entrenched in our little universes that can be hard to break out of.
Okay, so let's flip this coin over because we've talked about some of the challenges. Now I'm going to say, what is an idea that reading the Civic Health Index inspired for you, that you think you will try to move forward, or that we should look for ways to move forward? So, what inspired you? And we'll start here again.
I really like this idea of creating some sort of network of civic engagement organizations and thinking through what that means, how that can look. Prior to living here, I lived in far western Montana, which I think that my community there had a similar sort of Chittenden County maybe is 30 minutes from the rest of Vermont, right? 30 minutes from Vermont, like a little bit different here. And so I've been thinking a little bit about how to use the power that I have as a member of an institution like the University of Vermont to help facilitate this process in a meaningful way.
Yeah, at Up for Learning, our focus is on partnership between young people and adults, and I think reading the report led me to view partnership as an approach to a lot of the challenges that are present there, and thinking specifically about how to build habits of youth civic engagement. I think there's just this idea of like, if we just express that we want young people to be part of this process, if we just like encourage enough people to come to a meeting or to like tune into this process, then that will like help them, develop the skills and the interests to be full participants. And the reality is that like that is the easy first step, and that the second harder step is saying, well, like what do we as adults need to change about our practices and our approaches to, thinking about local issues or thinking about media, et cetera, to really like allow young people and any new participants to engage fully in the process. So I think that can be like systemic changes around how you think about structuring meetings, and are there ways to create opportunities for voice that don't involve Robert's rules, as an example.
Going back to the question of surprise, I was surprised at the decline in public meeting attendance given the proliferation of online options. So that was an interesting thing to me. And we did a piece in the Vermonter poll, a question last year, and the result was that 58% of the people surveyed in that poll reported that they watch local meetings online, mostly online, less on cable, and even on their cell phone. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity to reach people remotely. I think it's a question of packaging. We have been faced with your meetings, they're just so long. And so we created clickable agendas as a way to find little pieces of the meetings. And now we repurpose some of the meetings into short, like highlight reels, so people can get the highlight reels of the meetings if they're interested in it. And I think trying to, so I think creating content that's relevant and easy to consume. And I think the other is engaging young people and people that aren't particularly adept or experienced by talking about things that are relevant to them. I mean, again, why does a younger person want to come to a public meeting? I mean, what are we talking about that has bearing on them? But when there is something, they will come. So let's think about the design of what we're doing in some different ways.
I guess one of the things that I said last week when we were in Brattleboro is that I think there's a lot more civic engagement going on than we think, right? We are in a room of people that we all largely look the same, right? We're all largely middle-aged. We're all largely of one racial background and probably one, a relatively traditional gender identities and sexual orientations. But there is a lot of work happening among young people, among other communities that we're just not seeing because we are not in those rooms. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that and maybe give up some power to the work that's already happening and make that work the priority instead of the rooms that we're always sitting in.
And those stories would be good to know and hear. I mean, some of those organizations are mentioned here, but I think there are many more. I mean, I have a good example of that. One of the projects that we have at CCTV work with is the Vermont Language Justice Project. And it was starting during COVID to translate public health messages into multiple languages. So now it's 19 languages. And the reason that it's effective is because the people that are translating the messages and reciting them are leaders of their language communities. And then they, in turn, are distributing the messages. So folks, for example, that work in the Chinese restaurant business are all getting WhatsApp updates from their recognized community leader all across the state. And so identifying those community leaders as allies in this process of civic engagement in groups that we might not typically be engaged with ourselves because of who we are, I think goes back to that being curious about what's happening.
Yes, be curious about your neighbors. That's a really, I think, inspiring challenge for all of us. How many of you know the people who live closest to you? Good, most of you do. All right. So we are just about at time for our panel discussion, and I think the last thing I would like to ask you all to contemplate and share your thoughts with the group is what are the segments of your particular community, knowing that not all of you live here in South Burlington, maybe some of you are from further away than South Burlington as well, but what are the segments of your own community that you would like to see more civically engaged? We've touched on a few of them as we've unpacked some of the indicators in the report, but what segment of your community maybe do you personally feel like you're not connected with or is not connected civically by any of those measures? And I guess we'll go back down to Christopher at the end, following the pattern.
Sure. I guess, being part of the organizing team, I got to choose the story for arts and culture. And the story I chose was Vermont Reads Gather. And that has been an amazing experience for us. For folks who don't know the book, Gather by Ken Cadow is a really wonderful book about a young person who learns differently than traditionally and is trying to take care of his family at a time when his mom is really struggling with addiction. And that book there's now 7,500 copies out in 110 different communities around the state. And the reports that we get back of what young people are doing with that book and the kinds of conversations that they're having and the kinds of action that they're taking has been truly amazing to see. And I just think there are ways to trigger this involvement that are not about forcing people to do something, right? It's about finding the pathway to make it possible to be involved. And, I think reading is one of those things.
I think the effort that we're making at CCTV and Town Meeting TV to engage other people that have not traditionally come into the studio to make TV. I don't even like to use the word other people, but people who have not come in. I think the team there has done a remarkable job, not of passively waiting for people to come in and use the equipment, but actively going out into the field, because really community media is not about media. It's about organizing, and it's about community, and it's about having a tool to draw people in to have conversations. So unless you, as a person working in that organization, are, again, curious and interested in what's happening, you're not going to be showing what's happening. And there's so much. So now I think there's increasingly a broad range of lived experience being represented for other people to watch. And I will just add that I was looking at some numbers, and not only are there 18,000 programs a year being produced in these 24 community media centers, but last year we had 1.3 million YouTube views collectively. So people are watching and people are producing, and it's very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, one challenging trend that we see up with the school teams that we work with is that oftentimes the participants are overwhelmingly female-identified students, and even just looking at the photo of the group at the State House, it was overwhelmingly appeared to be female-identified students, and I think how young men engage in these spaces, and specifically in school spaces, thinking about engaging in roles as advocates for others, as activists for equity, and not seeing their presence right now, and wondering how to support that presence. I think that's definitely an aspect of this that I consider.
Even though I do work in the voting and election space, I try and think about civic engagement from more of the different components that we saw on the chart before. And so shifting some of my thinking beyond get somebody registered, right? Then think about how do we get to the polling place on election day. But I'm also thinking about engagement in terms of how to use my position as a teacher of public administration, a teacher of public service, to encourage students to participate in their own ways. So actually I'm making my students go to budget hearings around the state this semester. I'll report back at the end of the semester. We'll see how it goes. But just as a way of demystifying the process a little bit, right? It's like going into a bank for the first time, right? You don't know what to expect. You don't know Robert's rules. The whole process can feel very challenging. And so trying to think about ways to break down those barriers, to encourage real honest and inclusive participation, I think is a part of what I'm thinking about, and also linking that to advocating for those issues that they care about, right? It's not just casting a ballot, it's also being able to talk the policy talk and think about how to move those pieces forward in ways that are beneficial for their communities.
We, during my time in the legislature, we often talked about the budget is a moral document. And if you've ever watched a municipal budget hearing or even a legislative budget hearing, it doesn't look like they're talking about a moral document. But at the end of the day, once you wade through all of the decisions that are being made about where are we spending money and where are we not, it expresses the direction and the heart of where that group wants to go, which I think is a great place to ask young aspiring administrators to think and start, because if you can influence the budget, you can influence the direction of a group, an organization, a community. So I want to thank all of our panelists so much for being here. Thank you.